Zelensky said Ukraine could never accept peace talks without Kyiv's involvement, a message meant for President Trump. He called a meeting between Trump and Putin without the presence of Ukrainians or Europeans dangerous.
Some in Europe may be frustrated with Brussels, but let's be clear. If not Brussels, then Moscow. It's your decision.
Zelensky also took questions from our own Christiane Amanpour. He talked the mixed messages from Washington and also the need for continued dialogue.
Do you understand what America's position is?
Yes.
Which is?
I think, to my mind, they are preparing atmosphere for their dialogue.
For their dialogue, which will be?
For the dialogue between Trump and Putin. And I think this is, it's up to them, but they can discuss everything they want, but not about Ukraine without us. And that's why in this case, especially in this case, I think it's a little bit dangerous. That's why I said that we need to talk more with the president and to talk more with his people, with his teams. Yesterday, as you said, yes, we had good conversation, and I think that I opened some new details for vice president. That's why I said it's not waste time. It's really very important, I think, diplomatic investment for the future, just and lasting peace for Ukraine.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I thought you were going to say some more things.
Your order.
Yeah. You just sort of, I suddenly got flummoxed.
I'm sorry.
You said Putin doesn't want peace. I mean, you just said it loud and clear here.
It's true.
So what is the dialogue? And have you convinced the Americans that A, Ukraine has to be at the table, and B, I guess the Europeans have to convince them that they have. Did you get a commitment from President Trump that you would meet with him first? Do you have a plan to meet with the president?
No, we have our plan, of course. It's our country, and that's why it's our plan.
All right, let's go now to CNN's chief national security correspondent, Alex Marquardt. Alex, in his remarks, Zelensky said it would be dangerous for President Trump to meet with Putin before him. Also talked about this army for and of Europe. Give us the headlines.
Well, I think both those things, Victor, really speak to the uncertainty and fear that President Zelensky has about the United States right now, particularly when he sees President Putin cozying up to President Trump and mixed signals, frankly, from different members of the Trump administration. So this was a really striking set of remarks from President Zelensky, both his own speech and then in that interview with Christiane Amanpour. It was, for lack of a better description, a call to arms, both literal and figurative. I mean, he said in no uncertain terms that Europe cannot count on the U.S. anymore, that the relationship with the United States is evolving, and there may come a time when the U.S. simply says no to Europe. He pointed directly to the speech by the American Vice President J.D. Vance just yesterday. Zelensky saying that, basically paraphrasing Vance, that decades of this old relationship between the United States and Europe is ending, and that Europe needs to adjust to that. Here's a little bit more of Zelensky said earlier today.
Some in Europe may not fully understand what's happening in Washington right now, but let's focus on understanding ourselves right here in Europe. We must give strength to Europe first. Does America need Europe as a market? Yes. But as an ally? I don't know. A few days ago, President Trump told me about his conversation with Putin. Not once did he mention that America needs Europe at the table. That says a lot. The old days are over when America supported Europe just because it always had.
And so Zelensky called on Europe to band together and defend their own interests, and he said it should be done through European armed forces. He literally called it an armed forces of Europe so that Europe's future depends on European needs and European priorities. Victor and Emma, of course, there are major questions about the state of these negotiations, which haven't even started yet, but there have been accusations that the Trump administration has already been giving concessions, has already been doing favors to President Putin. We heard the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, say a couple days ago that American forces would not go into Ukraine, that Ukraine would not be a member of NATO. That's something that has been echoed by the president himself. So there were a lot of questions for J.D. Vance when he got here to Munich from the Ukrainian side, from European officials. He kind of equivocated yesterday in Vance's meeting with Zelensky. He said that he wanted to keep all options on the table, that he was preserving optionality for President Trump. So certainly a lot of concern among the Ukrainians, among the Europeans. These negotiations just getting started in Ukraine, wanting to make sure that they are at the table when the fate of their country is really what's in play here. Victor, Emra.
Alex Marquardt, there in Munich for us. Thank you. Let's bring in now former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. Mr. Ambassador, good to have you back. Let's start here from the framework of President Zelensky's remarks, saying that Europe needs its own alliance. We must build the armed forces of Europe so that Europe's future depends only on Europeans, saying that the U.S. doesn't appear that they really need the Europe as allies. What was your reaction as former ambassador to NATO of that framework from Zelensky?
Well, my reaction was one of sadness, though I think he is also correct. I do think that the United States in the past few weeks has behaved in ways that make it incredibly hard for Ukraine, which is at war, for Europe, which is living on a continent at war, to rely on the United States. The United States is proving not to be a very reliable ally. And the two things that are most shocking over the past week are, one, the fact that the President of the United States decided to get on the phone with Vladimir Putin without talking to Europeans or without talking to Ukraine to promise a peace conference and a peace conversation that would take place between Washington and Moscow, even though Moscow is the aggressor and Kyiv is the victim, and not make them part of it. And then secondly, the lecture that we heard here from the Vice President about the nature of democracy, coming from a Vice President who still does not recognize that in 2000 Donald Trump lost the election and Joe Biden won, was not taken well by people here. And so there is this question that President Zelensky put on the table. Are we really still capable and able to rely on the United States, or should we rely only on ourselves?
And even in that context, President Zelensky said today that there would have to be some security guarantees to agree to peace with Russia. There are already security guarantees from the 1991 independence after the Orange Revolution. So who would have to offer those guarantees? Would that be the U.S. again, considering the situation Ukraine finds itself in now, or would those have to be guaranteed by Europe?
Well, I mean, I personally would argue that those guarantees would have to include membership in NATO for Ukraine, which is how we traditionally have dealt with the insecurities on the continent. This is a continent that only had 12 countries as members of NATO. It now has 32, and the reason is because certain parts of Europe have found it better and more secure to be part of NATO than not be part of NATO, as we found with Finland and Sweden. But the president has ruled that out. He has taken the Russian mantra that the war was caused by the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. That is, of course, absurd. The war was caused when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we had Pete Hegseth, his defense secretary, ruling out not only NATO membership, but U.S. participating in any security guarantee. So again, I think what President Zelensky is saying is we can't rely on the United States. We have to rely on Europe. And now is time for Europeans to do more, not only to defend their continent, but also to help and secure Ukraine's future. It's a tough task for Europe. It doesn't have the forces at the moment. It is not spending enough in order to get those forces. But I see in Munich here a wake-up call among Europeans to say, we would like to do it with the United States, We would prefer to do it with the United States, but we've got to do it even if we can't do it with the United States.
You know, that's interesting. You say you see a wake-up call there because former President Biden used to tell stories about the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the questions about U.S. leadership and abdicating its position on the world stage. Do you think what happened this week, the pairing of what we saw from Vice President Vance and the reaction in the room and what happened today with President Zelensky is a pivot point for Europe?
Yeah, I think it's a pivot point. You know, it's not only what happened here today and yesterday, it's also what happened this week. The phone call that the president made with Vladimir Putin, the tariffs that have been imposed on aluminum, steel imports to the United States, the reciprocal tariffs that are about to be imposed. The United States, under Donald Trump, has a tendency to turn friends into enemies and enemies into friends. That's not the way in which most Europeans think the world ought to be run, and as a result, they're going to have to figure out a way to deal with the world as it is without the United States, and at times even have to oppose it.